sometimes. I look around the room, and I think I'm correct in remembering that I may be the only survivor from 1977, when the center was refounded. It went back, as John said this morning, much earlier, but it was refounded in 1977 for the kind of global commitments that you all represent. And here I am, all these years later, still here. But there are those who are not here. And John, if I may just for a moment be slightly nostalgic, don't worry, I'll say something else. But there were, the founding director was Martin Troe. We had Neil Smeltzer, who just died, also a director. Arnie Lyman came in for a short period of time. Mike Heyman, who was chancellor at Berkeley, also took over. There are others, and they contribute to this. And John and your staff, Judd and your staff, Henry, your staff, have put the conference together. I don't think we've thanked you enough. I'll thank you on behalf of you. And I want to tell you something else that you probably don't know. It's really very good to be alive. At any rate, I cannot, it's not easy to disagree with what the previous speakers have said, so I won't disagree. I think that they've laid out all of the elements pretty well and given us a lot of material that we can reflect upon and perhaps even discuss in the panel. But there are a few things I'd like to insinuate of a slightly different character into the discussion in order to round it out. I'm talking as an offshore observer, although having attended British University in my life and having taught British history, I'm more than just casually involved. What was interesting to me when Brexit occurred, Brexit quite fascinating really if you're an offshore observer and not emotionally involved, is not Brexit itself, but why did the British ever enter into the European Union? That always seemed to me the interesting historical question. And because this is a proud nationalist society from a very early age. And you remember, some of you may remember the famous saying from the Second World War, that fog over the English Channel, the continent is isolated. And the Blue Water search, the search for an empire bypassing Europe, was very characteristic of British history. So why even join the European Union? And we can just name a few of the principal reasons. One of them is the decline of empire, certainly. Imperial and trade preferences and all that went with it. The second was also the decline of the special relationship with the United States. That special relationship, very important following the Second World War, was deteriorating. And there was the hyperinflation of the 1970s. And then there was, I don't know how attractive this might have been to some, the original vision behind the European Union, what became called the Union, and that was the Jean Monnet vision of Europe that would no longer be at war, and where cooperation and respect for all peoples would prevail. I'm not so sure how much of a factor that might have been, but it might have been an appeal to some. So the removal of these former safeguards, these distancing institutions and history led Britain into the European Union. So you could say that although the vote was close, that there was still enough of a fissure, there was still enough of a line there that it could break, and Britain would, or some people in Britain, would want to refer back to what had been the historical situation. A few words about nationalism. We've spoken about it today entirely in negative terms because that is what we see. And there is a positive element to nationalism. I think it's useful to remember it. And that is a pride in one's country, one's heritage, one's traditions, sometimes one's language and one's literature, but not without a critical attention to that heritage. So it's not accepted blindly, but it provides a source of pride and a source of identity. That is the positive form of nationalism. Now, Dean Brady said this morning that nations and nationalistic ideas are based on myths. Often enough, that's true. there are also good myths. John Locke's theory of social contract and rebellion, which went into the making of the American Constitution, is a good myth. So there are good myths in the world. Just saying that, not to alter any of the remarks that have been made, but only to provide that wider historical perspective. The other bit that I might mention is to follow through on the idea of identity, is that, and nationalism, universities and nationalism, is that for most of the 800-year history of universities, institutions like universities, institutions that we call universities, they were servants of church and state. And in the states can turn nasty, and often did. But certainly, at the time of the Reformation, British universities turned. We're now going to be defenders of a Protestant establishment. At other times, heresies were, the antagonism towards heresies were led by academics. So we go through that long history where we will find an extremely complicated reaction of universities to the national entities that might support them and provide them with the bulk of their students. That is, often enough, they are defenders of the status quo. And what altered that, and what brings us to the present situation, was the development of research function. Because when the mission of a university, which it was mostly historically, was either the training of professionals or the inculcation, as it came later, of liberal education, those were often associated with national needs or regional needs. And I have to remind myself that, at least in the Anglo-American tradition, many of the noble ideas associated with what we call liberal education were associated with conceptions of citizenship and service, in fact, to the nation at a positive level, but certainly service to the nation. The research function, developing out of Germany, adopted by every university in the world today, altered that conception. And I think, although the lines, academic lines had been crossed in earlier centuries, research really intensified the notion that universities are, in fact, unique institutions with global commitments and can very well pursue that apart from what might be considered narrow national needs. So I think it's important to remember that. And it makes me think that universities also have a very special kind of identity. And I'm sometimes hard put to explain why that should be. I was speaking to some of my colleagues here this morning about Clark Kerr's conception of the multiversity. Clark Kerr was a major person in the history of the University of California, is a major person in the history of United States higher education. And in the famous 1963 lectures at Harvard, created that term. I may have had some sources. I asked him once about it. He may have some sources for it. It came from elsewhere, but essentially it's associated with him. And the definition of a university as a multiversity is that it has innumerable constituents, each of which seek their own lines of connection and recognition outside the university or inside the university. But what then arises in my own mind is what keeps these institutions together? Why is there a loyalty to Berkeley? Because there is. Why is there a loyalty to Harvard? Because there is. Why is there a loyalty to Cambridge? Because there is. And you can name your own institutions. So that whole bonding mechanism of what makes one loyal to this institution gives it its international force, right? And a certain pride and feeling that it can and should take a stand against all the things that have been mentioned today, against injustice, against narrow-mindedness, against faltering economies. Perhaps is that strong notion that knowledge really does drive a civilized society, and that the academic profession is above all committed to knowledge and to the pursuit of knowledge, or the philosopher John Stuart Mill once said, to follow the argument whithersoever it goes. So John, you're standing up, yep. And we are now going to give my injunction, follow the argument, yes, whithersoever it goes.
Yes, right? Exactly. So, round of applause.